Nice. That's Paul Simon's new song from his newest album, one of his new songs, Wristband. I'll let you put that all together like we like to do in here sometimes, figuring out what this all means. I'm going to tell you a joke that I've told before, and I apologize because I probably told it a couple of times over the years. It's one of my favorite jokes to tell at this time of year, especially during the political season. And I'm particularly telling it to you today because I truly want to invite you. I'm not going to insist, but I want to invite you to tell this joke to others. It may provide some perspective. I don't know. I'm going to use the cleaned up version. So a guy was traveling in Minnesota, new state, never been there before, and he walked into a bar. Wanted to kind of know who the people in this town were, what they were like. Well, who are these people anyway? What am I dealing with here? So he walks in and decides he's just going to just come right out and say it. So he said, all right, hey everyone, every last Republican is a horse's rear end. Cleaned up version. And he was soundly grabbed up, beat to a pulp, thrown out the door into the street. They went back in the bar. He stood up. He says, well, I guess I know who these people are. So the next day, walks back into the same bar, feeling much more confident and assertive, and he says, every last Democrat is a horse's rear end. They grab him up, beat him to a pulp, throw him out into the street. He's standing up, shaking his head, brushing off the dirt and the dust, and he's scratching his head when the guy comes out of the bar, and he says to him, I don't get it. What's with you people? And the guy from the bar says, no, you don't understand, mister. This is horse country. Everybody get that one? This is horse country. That's important. I want you to keep that in mind. Seems like our politicians haven't figured out. They think it's all about them. You been watching the Olympics? Yeah? Race walking? Badminton? Table tennis? You've been watching it? It's awesome. Synchronized swimming? Some pretty cool stuff. Dressage. Who knows what dressage is? All right. It's basically wealthy horses and wealthy owners doing pretty dances. It's like horse dancing, you know. The British, I think, won it this year. I'm not sure, but it's already happened. The rhythmic synchronized rhythm is happening next week. This coming week, if you get a chance. It's basically like group juggling. They spin around and do fancy things and throw things in the air together and time it and all. It's very pretty to watch. I know you've been watching Michael Phelps. You've been watching, and I forget her name, Gabby, thank you, Douglas, yes. All those great Olympic award winners, you know, and it's interesting. When Lance Armstrong, we found out eventually, you know, that all these winnings, he'd been doping and stuff, and it was frustrating. We're going to find out that Michael Phelps is actually a fish. All those awards going to be taken away from him. It's fun to watch, and the ideal of the Olympic competition is really a great thing. I think the concept is a great thing. I think sometimes we get a little lost in the process of watching, a little caught up. But the ideal behind it, that people from other countries, from all around the world, come together in a sort of competitive but open, friendly environment. And there's not so much politics going on as there sometimes can be. And while it's definitely competitive, you see this embracing of others afterwards. Here's the thing, though. It's sort of like this, our worldview kind of is modeled in the Olympics too. Not the worst of us, but it's there. It's there, this worldview that the object of life is to reach perfection. The object of life is to succeed at something excellent. And so we have these wonderful gymnasts, and we have these wonderful swimmers, and we have these professional basketball players, and we have all these people sort of exemplifying perfection, and we like watching that, and it somehow kind of feels like our lives are, we kind of have this lack, this longing that maybe we could kind of strive for that. I'm really not interested. I mean, I like it, I'm watching it some, but I'm not interested in Michael Phelps. I want to know why the losers are there. I want to know why they have decided to be there knowing they can't win. There are definitely people there who know they're not going to win. Why are they there? That's what I want to know. That's what I want to hear about. We never hear those stories. We're not going to talk about Michael Phelps' story today. We're going to talk about this other guy. He barely made the finals, and he's in the race. I want to know about that. JFK said this interesting thing years ago, John F. Kennedy. He said, "Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we all are ultimately mortal." So here's the question I want to give you as we think about this text this morning. Here's the question I want you to think about. How do you, I'll pose it to you, how do you live into the future you would like to envision as reality? What would that reality be in its most ideal form? What can you envision that being? How would you live into that reality that you envision? Not just for yourself, but since you envision this bigger reality, how would you live into that with integrity? A couple of weeks ago, Linda and I attended this conference. I told you briefly about it last week. We were in Santa Fe. We were at this gathering, ecumenical gathering that was founded by Image Journal magazine. And if you've not seen Image Journal, it's a really great magazine on faith, on mystery, and art. It sort of comes together with poetry, writing, art, visual art, and then writing essays, stories. It's an interesting sort of attempt to look at the sacred in life. But the curious thing about it is that it combines so many different perspectives. And so here we were in Santa Fe, which is a great setting, and we were at this Catholic college, St. John's College. And even though the magazine was founded on and started by Catholics, by folks deep in the Catholic Church, what tends to be there now are sort of what I've called spiritual refugees. Folks who no longer find the Catholic Church speaking to them. They've sort of left, and now they're looking. People from the far evangelical right will show up at this place because their Pentecostal church that they grew up with is no longer speaking to who they are. Something's not clicking. It's as if all of these different denominations, these people are kind of coming as spiritual refugees because they're recognizing it's about the horses. And nobody else is recognizing that. Everybody else is talking about this side or that side, but it's really about the horses. And so they're trying to find out if there's some place they can come together, some common place where they can experience the sacred without all of the defined sort of boundaries. It's interesting to sit at the table with some of these folks, because there I was sitting with one group at one lunchtime, and we were just chatting when all of a sudden I spoke about how our community here, our community is pretty inclusive. Our community is very open, even though the Methodist Church is still struggling with issues of marriage equality. Our church has been, our community here, and First Methodist for that matter, has been very open and inclusive, and I think willing to really struggle with that, to realize that the kingdom is about everybody, to realize that love is about everybody. And as I'm talking about this, I'm noticing that the people who are sitting there at the table with me are kind of moving further away from me. They're kind of edging over this way, just for a moment, though. And then I said, I'm sorry, is that uncomfortable? And the woman looked at me and she said, I think the gays have a point. And I looked at her and I didn't say anything. I just kind of smiled. And she said, you know what? What I realize, maybe I don't know everything. And I smiled at her and I said, you know what? I don't either. And all of a sudden we're talking about horses. You know what I mean? That's what started happening all week long from all these different perspectives, is this willingness to move past our stance in order to try to be inclusive of all stances. But it has to be everybody. Clearly, it has to be everybody. But it's challenging. So I'm sitting there at the table one lunch day, and I hear this wonderful story that I'd never heard before. That it made me think of this. Made me think of this story when I read this text. A young nun from the St. Francis order, the Franciscan order, was in my writing group. I was in the workshop on writing and spirituality, and she was sitting at the table, and she said, it's August. And I said, yeah. And she said, did you know that August, being a Catholic, she said, did you know that August has the greatest proliferation of saints than any other month? And I said, in fact, I didn't know that. I'm Methodist, but I think that's interesting. And she said, it's not just interesting, it's ironic. And I said, why is that? And she said, because it's August. And I said, I'm still not following. She says, August, it's named after Caesar Augustus. It's named after the emperor of Rome. Not just the emperor, but the founder of Rome. She said, do you know why Rome was founded, why it worked, why he was able to establish it? And I said, well, honestly, I don't. She said, because he tricked everybody. She said the whole Roman Empire was established on deceit. And I thought, wow, I couldn't believe this. She said, it's a fact. She said, every one of the republics around the Roman Empire, before the Roman Empire was established as a single empire, all of the Roman republics were struggling because they had individual rulers who were doing their own thing, who were being their own oppressive sort. People were really frustrated. Some guy comes in and promises to change everything. He's going to make it all better. And they all followed suit. I'm not making a comparison. I'm telling you about Caesar Augustus. Go read it. It's Caesar Augustus. I'm not talking about Hitler even, but you can read it. It's Hitler too. But I'm not making the comparison. What I'm saying is that if you get scared enough, you'll stop thinking. If you get scared enough, you'll stop using your mind. And it's real easy to get afraid. So here's this guy, she says, that was sainted in he was sainted in 2007. He was beatified, but he lived in the 1940s. He was born in 1907. His name was, and I was going to do this without my notes, but I'm going to have to use my notes, I'm afraid. His name was Franz Jagerstatter, but his first name was Franz Huber. Franz Huber was born in Austria. He was born of no consequence. His life would not have suggested a candidate for sainthood. He was born out of wedlock. He lived back and forth between grandparents. When his biological father died in World War I, he was given over. His mother remarried to a guy named Jagerstatter, and so he was adopted and became Franz Jagerstatter. Now, but again, there was nothing to him. I mean, think about his broken life, his mixed up life. You can see he was basically a Marlon Brando kind of character. In The Wild Ones, he lived his life that way. He had a motorcycle. He went from town to town. He kind of corralled it up at clubs, at bars. He had a string of broken relationships. He had a couple of kids himself out of wedlock. He was not your typical candidate for sainthood. And then he met a woman, Francesca, who changed his life. Devout Catholic, but more than anything, she was a person about love. She simply encouraged him to find his own way of loving in the midst of his life. She led the example. He fell in love with her, they got married, and then they had a couple of daughters themselves. And then in 1933, things changed drastically. In the mid-1930s, Hitler came into power. Austria was annexed. Franz Jagerstatter was the only person in his community, in his village, who stood opposed to the annexation, vocally so. And then some years later, when he was a farmer, about 4 or 5 years later when he was conscripted into the military service, he tried to defer a couple of times out of conscientiousness. But finally in 1942, or late 42 or 43, he finally was conscripted. But he went to his fellow Catholic clergy, and he went to his bishop, and he pleaded with them to help him with his decision, because he didn't believe in this war, number one, and he certainly didn't believe in Hitler. And he wasn't going to give oath to him. All of them said, do it. Just acknowledge Hitler. All sorts of good Christians are fighting in the war. Just do it. You see what happens to people when they don't. But he couldn't do it. He went totally with his conscience. And in 1943, he refused to participate in the war, and he denounced Hitler. Immediately arrested. About 3 months later, he was executed. Right before he died, he had written a couple of letters to his wife, apologizing and yet also thanking her because of what she gave up in order for him to be a person of conscience as he was. But in his last letter, he had said, I hope and pray that my actions will at least speak beyond my life. I have to believe that my actions will speak beyond my life. And in a curious twist of fate, they did. After the war ended, a fellow came and he wrote a book called Singular or Solitary Witness. He was looking for Catholic refusal or the Catholic story in relation to Hitler. And he came across Franz Jagerstatter. And he wrote this book basically about Franz's life. Then in 1970, this guy named Daniel Ellsberger, you heard of him? Was an advisor, military advisor, the Nixon administration. Also was tried on treason for exposing the Pentagon Papers, which showed how the government had done all sorts of illegal and mischievous things with regard to the war. He was eventually acquitted, of course. But Daniel Ellsberger said the one thing that really changed his mind was that book, The Life of Franz Jagerstatter. Did you know the root word for compassion and is the same root word as giving birth, as being born? It has the same root. Now think about that for a second, because when we think of compassion, we often think of be nice to people. We often think of be concerned about people. Share a little bit for people. But compassion is actually rooted more in this sense of it's gonna hurt. Now, I've never given birth before. My wife says, you've never given birth before. She reminds me that often. But you know, women I would assume that my wife tells me this too, that process seems worth it. That pain seems worth it. It's interesting to me that the root word in Aramaic is similar with compassion and birthing. This idea that it's not comfortable. It's self-giving. It's self-sacrificing. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think our text today is not simply talking about laying down your life, blind martyrdom, and yet it is talking about living our lives in such a way that God help us. It says something about love for the future. It says something about what the future might be. But the main problem that gets in the way is fear. I'm reading this book by Diana Butler Bass that's called Grounded, Finding God in the World. Now, Diana Butler Bass has written a number of books about Christianity, what's the future of Christianity. She's not clergy. She's not active in the church as a clergy person. She teaches in colleges and speaks around the world, but she speaks to matters of faith from a very different perspective. And one of the things that she argues is she says this idea of commons, this idea of what we would actually call, and what Jesus, I think, calls the kingdom of God, where everybody's involved, where we're not killing our enemies, but we're praying for our enemies, where we're not so much afraid of what's coming across the border as going across the border to invite. It's really messy. It's not clean at all. But she says there's one problem that gets in the way of this commons. And she said it's fear. It's fear of the other. All it takes is a little bit of it, and you can start capitalizing on it, right? And pretty soon, We don't know what the truth is anymore. We're just afraid, so we're reacting out of fear. But you can go further back. There's this wonderful little personality test, kind of personality guideline called the Enneagram. Some of you are familiar with the Enneagram. And the Enneagram helps us to discern more about who we are and what we are, as well as kind of in a spiritual way, what we're capable of in a bigger picture. But it's rooted in what motivates us. What motivates us to be the way we are. And you know what the motivation is? Fear. That's the basic motivation behind all of them. Now, the challenge is, of course, to get past that fear. But the fear is there. Afraid we won't be successful. Afraid we won't amount to anything. Afraid that we won't be connected, that we'll be left alone. Afraid that we can't trust the world around us. Just very basic fears are at the heart of all of our lives and all that we do. And we can throw that. I mean, even our interest in the Olympics, at times when we get really caught up in that, there's this sense in which it's a projection of what we fear about our own inabilities and our own longings to be something. One of the people that's been a big influence in my life, ironically, because he's far more conservative than I am, is this guy named Bob Goff. Anybody ever read anything by Bob Goff? He wrote this wonderful book called Love Does. You read Love Does? Yeah. It's a great book. Have you met Bob? I got to meet him. What a jovial person. Just effervescence, just love, joy, just emanating from him. He's a big guy. He's about 6'3". I saw him, oddly enough, I was at the Young Life fundraiser for the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I had been invited to go there with some family members. And again, this is far more conservative than I would usually be. And yet, I listened to Bob share his story. Bob Goff is a big-time lawyer, founded a big-time law firm in Florida and California. Millions of dollars he's earned over the years with this thing. He was making a church trip to India, basically, one time. And while there was overwhelmed, I think it was about 12 years ago, overwhelmed with some of the poverty, but even more so, the human trafficking that was going on there. And he discovered that that kind of thing was going on in all sorts of places around the world. And just felt moved to suddenly make a difference in whatever way he could. Now, he had resources, so he founded the Restore International, which is a nonprofit designed for helping confront governments and helping communities deal with human trafficking and with oppressiveness and impoverishment. Great nonprofit. And he's an interesting and great individual, and I couldn't help but be inspired. But this is what stuck with me. Because even though Bob and I disagree on a lot of things, and we visited at the table because I was sitting with some of the hosts of that event, even though we disagreed on some things, he came down to this final place. He said, essentially, if I'm speaking metaphorically, it's about the horses. It's about the kingdom. It's about love. But the problem is it's not pretty. It's never meant to be pretty. In fact, as one of my mentors, Roland Perdue, a Presbyterian minister, would say at the end of a sermon, he says, if you're really enjoying church and it's just looking really great and everybody's in cahoots with each other and you're all in the same mindset, it's not church. And then he'd sit down. And my wife and I, who were students at UT, would be sitting there going like, I don't know what to do now. But that's the truth. I mean, that's the fact. The fact is that it's not about you or me. It's not about our comfort zone. And so Bob had this cup that he passed around, and everybody got one at the table, and I still have it with me. And it says, yikes, on it. All it says is yikes. And he said, here's the interesting thing about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, which the doors are open and everybody is included. Every color, every orientation, every political disposition, everybody's included because it's not about you or me. It's about the horses. It's about love. And he says, if you're in some place doing ministry, the layperson, your faith journey, and you don't feel a little bit of yikes on a pretty regular basis, chances are you're not in it. Amen.